welcome to an Epicenter conversation here in Denmark. It's my great pleasure to welcome Otto Brøns-Petersen, who is the head of analysis at CEPOS. And today we will talk about debt and European indebtedness, because last week I was at an economic conference where I was essentially told that I should not worry about repaying debt because countries are not like households. The debt to GDP ratio doesn't matter as long as we can service our debt. But in the UK, where I live, repayment of the debt, so servicing our debt, is now the fourth largest budget item, just after education and before defense spending. So even servicing our debt is quite costly. You have written a recent paper for Epicenter called The Debt Bomb. So I suspect that you disagree with my colleague at the economic conference that that doesn't matter. But could you elaborate why in Western Europe and across the European Union debts have been structurally rising over the last 20, 25 years? We are past the Maastricht ceiling of 60%, and not just here in Denmark, but across the board. Why is that?
When the Maastricht Treaty was introduced, they had very strict rules on indebtedness because they realized that there is an incentive for countries trying to load their debt or debt burden onto other countries. So, and in order to avoid this, there were strict rules in the Maastricht Treaty, basically saying you can have joint liability. Every country is liable for its own debt. And furthermore, there are rules, ceilings for how big the deficits you can run and how much debt you can have.
But so, this has changed massively, right? Because now the Maastricht rules are still there in theory, but pretty much everyone has been ignoring it for the last 20 years.
Yes.
But why is that if the rules are there, it's possible to ignore them? So.
Well, in theory, we had perhaps the strongest protection against this free rider problem in debt that you could imagine. The problem is that they have never, the rules are in fact quite good, but they have never been enforced. And so we have seen that the debt ratio has been growing structurally ever since the euro was introduced a quarter of a century ago. When we have an economic upturn, sometimes the debt ratios, they stabilize or fall a little bit, but when we have a shock, they rise and they never return to the pre-crisis level. So they are structural increases, and some countries have very high debt ratios, up to double the allowed amount of debt, which is 60% of GDP.
Well, and these rules have seemed to be watered down, or at least the enforcement seemed to have been watered down over the last couple of years. If some of the biggest EU member states are not keeping to the rules, then obviously it's a bit hypocritical to enforce them with smaller ones. Can you get around this political problem? So what would be the solution, your solution, to actually enforce the Maastricht criteria?
I think it is very difficult because we started out having very strict rules. It was built into the Constitution, and so now we have the problem that we have a Constitution which is not adhered to. So that really is a big problem. Of course, the essence of the reason why politicians tend to take on too much debt is that they can shift the cost of their policies to someone else.
The next future generations.
Especially if the future generation are going to pay off the debt. In a union, it's the one we have in the EU, you can also shift some of the debt burden to other countries. So to fix this, we need to introduce some shifting back of the costs of putting on debts, and that's very difficult to put in place. But you could, and you know this from most clubs, have the principle that you have to pay your dues in order to be in good standing, in order to enjoy membership rights. So that could be one way of policing these rules, saying that member states that are not complying with the fiscal rules are not allowed to have the same membership rights as normal members.
So what does that mean practically? Suspending the voting rights or not giving them cohesion money? Well, what is the exact punishment if you don't keep to the Maastricht
I think you could think in terms of many different things. That could be, say, the offices are not open to member states if they don't abide by the rules. Or that could be having fines. There are fines in available, but they have never been used. They could try using them. And then, of course, what would really help, but which is very difficult, is to build in some automatic sanctions. So in principle, we had the strictest automatic sanctions you could imagine by putting this into the constitution. But because the countries have agreed not to enforce the constitutional rules, we are now in a very difficult place.
And maybe it's worth stepping back a little. So obviously enforcement of the rules is important, not just for the sake of enforcement, but because we care about the rules. But I think it's worth discussing a little bit why the average European should care whether our debt to GDP ratio is 60% or 160%. So why should we care?
It is true, as you mentioned, that a country can, if it's going to exist forever, it could in principle run a debt forever, but it requires that the debt ratio is not exploding at some point in time. That's if it does, you get into first increasing costs of financing the debt. Interest rates are going up, and in the end, you could end up in bankruptcy. This is not something that hasn't happened. It happens once in a while that countries go bankrupt, and that's a risk. I think that two things to be aware of here. One thing is that when you have this incentive to load off debt on other members, you end up in a sort of a prisoner's dilemma kind of situation where everybody is running up too much debt because they can load off the debt on somebody else. So, and this is a situation nobody should be interested in. It's like if you had a restaurant and you were and the customers were sharing the bill from the entire restaurant. Everybody would be eating more and more expensively than they would otherwise do. So that's one problem. And the problem is that as we get closer to the risk of bankruptcy and you have an incentive to fiscal irresponsibility, something that can go on forever will stop at one point. And if you have a system which is very vulnerable to debt crisis, you would have to solve it at one point or another. And that could be by centralizing. And so we should realize, and this has happened before, it's happened in the US when it was founded. Because of debt crisis, they had much more centralized system of government that they were supposed to. And this is also what would be necessary in Europe if we can fix this debt problem in a decentralized manner.
But I think this is something seen as positive by many. So let me take the example of Eurobonds. There has been a lot of discussion since the pandemic that was meant to be a temporary setup just for addressing the economic shortcomings during the pandemic. But now the idea of Eurobonds is being floated quite widely because from an investor's perspective, it seems to be a safe asset. So actually market participants are calling out for it. From the EU's perspective, it's a perfect excuse for some further centralization and further control for the European Commission. And for some of the member states, mainly the ones that are borrowing at a higher cost, it's a chance to borrow jointly at a lower cost. So if so many different participants of the economy are calling for the same thing, namely joint Eurobonds, what's the reason to oppose it?
But there's no magic in Eurobonds. The EU countries don't get a higher capacity for carrying debt because they issue common bonds. But of course, if you did issue Eurobonds, we have some Eurobonds, if we issued more, then you would really rely on the capacity to handle debt on the countries that are not so indebted. So Eurobonds are a way of redistributing income, not in an open way, but in a hidden way among countries. And I think that could be dangerous because this could, in the end, if some countries are paying the bills, why there is an incentive to behave irresponsibly, then it might lead to a much more centralized EU. Some might like that, but it could also end to result in a breakup because some countries or then populations wouldn't be willing to pay the bill. And I think this could for instance, be the case in Germany. The German population is not keen on common debt for exactly this reason.
So, given the real politics and the realities that we live in, we have a geopolitical crisis that's going on with the ongoing war and Russia's and Chinese increased aggression. We have a demographic crisis, less and less, or fewer people being born in the EU. And we have economic stagnation. So even repaying some of our already existing debts with the shrinking or same-sized economy, it's going to be more and more difficult. So how do you get out of this negative cycle of low growth, demographic crisis, geopolitical crisis, without actually spending more and without actually new more debt?
Well, you can get out of a serious fiscal situation. Countries in the EU have done that. My own country, Denmark, used to have a very high debt problem. We don't anymore. You saw Ireland getting very severely hit by a financial crisis, and were in a debt crisis really because of this. They are now in a fine shape. So, and the way to do that is by reforming your economy. So you can, of course, you can save your way to this to some extent, but
Germany has tried it in a way,
yes.
And that some argue was to the detriment of the whole European Union because the low investment rates, low economic growth, the kind of German fiscal rules weren't really endorsed by a lot of people.
And when you have debt ratios perhaps in excess of 100% of GDP, it's very difficult to save your way to a lower debt ratio by alone. So you need growth. You need economic reform that growth your GDP. Then that would automatically lower your debt to GDP ratio. So it's not it is possible, but of course we have to realize in Europe that we need to prioritize. When the Berlin Wall fell, we had the peace dividend. Basically, that peace dividend has gone now, but politicians all over Europe are insisting that they should keep it and that somebody else should pay for it. And that's why they are suggesting that military spending should be financed by debt. There's no good reason why it should, other than trying to shift the burden to basically to our ancestors or
the young generation.
Young generations.
Indeed.
Sorry.
Indeed, but I think what you're saying essentially, if you want to solve this problem, like Denmark has in the past, or like Ireland has in the past, then you have a ready-made recipe. You can have fiscal expenditures being reduced, strong economic growth, and then your GDP for that ratio is going to turn out to be better. So how do you actually see the political side happening? We know what we need to do in practice, but the politics is always something different. Economic theory and political feasibility are not always the same. So if you could convince the policymakers of major EU member states what they can do that's politically also feasible, and spending cuts are often very, very difficult, what would you try to say to them?
Well, I think we might enter a phase where debt problems are getting so serious that they are getting the attentions of voters and politicians, not only in the EU, but also in other countries. The UK is now struggling with a debt problem, so you see their interest rates are going up because the debt ratio is quite high. The US has an unprecedented high debt ratios for peace times, and even if their economy has gone back to growing, they are still borrowing a lot of money. And I think I hope that voters and politicians are getting the message that they maybe didn't get at a time when we had very, very low interest rates. So it was easy to say, well, let's take on debt. It doesn't cost anything because we can borrow for almost nothing. This is not the case anymore. And hopefully there we'll see a willingness on part of the EU to enforce the rules much more strictly, and also reform the rules to make them more strict. The rules following up on the sort of the basic rules in the Maastricht Treaty. Unfortunately, they have just been reformed, and we have gone in the other direction. So it has been easier to take on debt, and there is no real focus on it. It has not been a priority for the new commission. Hasn't mentioned it at all in their first State of the Union address, and that's I think that's worrying.
And if you had to choose one or two European countries that you think are model for the others to follow, what would those be today?
Well, I think there are a number of models. Actually, countries of Eastern Europe are mostly have sound public finances. Nordic countries tend to have that as well. Ireland, as we talked about, took on reforms and from a very serious situation. Even Greece, which did in fact go bankrupt, have taken on some reforms and are in a process of reforming their economy, but they did it much too late, so they had to go through a bankruptcy. Greece is a small country, This would be much, much worse if a large country like France or Italy would to come into the same kind of problems.
So it's not just doom and gloom across the European Union, especially if we compare with our friends in the United States, where this is not even a discussion at the moment, or the rising guilt in the United Kingdom. At least there are some EU member states where the situation is not that bad. But there's plenty more to do. I've really enjoyed your insights, and I would very much recommend that people who are listening read the publication called The Debt Bomb. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation as well. Do let us know your comments, whether you think it's feasible to put the EU on a sustainable fiscal path with all of its member states. Can we actually reduce our debt under the current geopolitical tensions, or should we learn to love the debt bomb? Thank you so much for joining us.